Thank you very much. It's great to be part of this. I think the whole topic of the future of data collection is huge, incredibly important for what we do, and it's great that you're sponsoring this. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the research and some of the thinking we've done around the future of feedback and the way we do research. We've done some surveying of people to look at their interest in different ways of giving us feedback doing research, and I'm happy to share that with you now. So one of the things that's really interesting about people is that the way that we communicate is changing, and changing very rapidly and more rapidly over time. It really wasn't that long ago, a couple hundred years ago, that the way we communicated over long distances was things like smoke signals or big log drums. And then along came the telegraph, and that was the thing for a long time. And then came the telephone. And then came the fax machine, and then came email, and then came texting, and then came apps, and who knows what's next. But if you think about the arc of time, the way we communicate has changed very rapidly in the most recent times. And one thing about research is that it's tended to lag rather than lead. We struggled with switching from face-to-face to phone, and from phone to online, and from online to accommodating mobile, and we still don't do a particularly good job of even doing that. But we need to keep changing, and we need to keep evolving with the way that people actually communicate. So we can say, okay, yes, we're a bit laggy, but is that really a problem? Well, I think it is, and I saw this great paper at the NewMR Big Data Conference in Brooklyn last November. It was a researcher from Brazil who spoke about a public health study he'd been involved in, which was attempting to aid the government in eradicating the Zika virus. And this was right around the times of the Olympic Games. So huge public health concern. They needed to get as much data as possible and have it be as representative as possible, and it really was a matter of life and death. So they did a survey, and what they wanted to do was collect information on exactly where there were ponds and puddles and other places that were breeding grounds for mosquitoes. And they also wanted to figure out how many people were around there. And they needed to know exactly where they were so that they could go and actually dry up those puddles. So trying to get as much information from as many people as possible, they emailed out invitations, and they got 250,000 responses via email, which is fantastic because that gives you a map, literally a map of where these breeding grounds are. But they knew that not everybody used email. They knew that some people would use text instead. So then they texted out invites, and they got 300,000 additional responses. So the map is getting much better. But then they realized, of course, that people don't in Brazil, just text or email. The most common way of communicating is WhatsApp, an app designed for communication. And with that, they got an additional 750,000 responses, giving them not only a much more detailed map of exactly where to go in and eradicate the virus, but also ensuring that they're getting the kind of broad coverage of all the different socioeconomic groups. So in that case, if they had not used any one of those ways of communicating, they would have missed huge swaths of the population. So not being up on the way we communicate and not reaching people where they are and how they communicate can be very problematic. So we've asked about a few different ways of communicating and doing surveys that I'll just share with you now. Some of them worked, some of them don't work, and that's kind of what we're trying to figure out as we grapple through the changing times. So one of them is the virtual assistant. They're pretty popular. Half the population have virtual assistants. And this is data that is combined North American data. So Canada is down at about 10% of the sample here. And half have a virtual assistant. Overall, it's about a quarter of the population has a virtual assistant like a speaker, like Alexa or a Google Home. Others have it on their phone, typically. 4 in 10 have used it, so not everybody uses a virtual assistant, even though they have one. but a quarter would want to try surveys on it. Now, one thing about this, and I'll show you the data in a second, is that it's very much a generational story. The millennials are much more interested in new technology, and what we're seeing really is a generational divide. So here's these data. Same question. Amongst the millennials, 3/4 have a virtual assistant, more than half have used it, and 40% of them would want to try surveys on it. So this arc of the difference between generations is in all of these data that I'll show you, whether I dwell on that element or not. So one of the other things that we looked at is, would you want to use an app to join a community? Because apps are very attractive, as I mentioned with the WhatsApp. There's a lot of interest in using apps, and they can be incredibly dominant. So we asked a question about, would you want to join a community about investing in this case? So this is people who have investments, and we asked them, would you want to join a community about investing? So 1 in 5 say yes. And then we said, well, what if you needed to download an app in order to be part of this community? Well, then that shrinks quite considerably down to 14%. And then we said, well, what if you had to do all the surveys through the app? And that shrank down to just 5%. And that 5% tended to be more technologically advanced. They tended to be younger, and they tended to have less money. So they, in fact, were not representative of the pool of people that we started out with that we're interested in talking to. So in this case, an app, it turns out, is a community killer. One of the other things we asked about was texting, because if I want to get a hold of my children, I text them. If I want to get a hold of my sister-in-law, I'll send her an email. Different generations like different things. And so we wanted to ask about this. And here the blue bar is the US, the red bar is Canada. And we can see that there's quite a bit of interest in receiving text invites to participate in research on mobile phones. So this is definitely something that needs to be part of the standard repertoire at this point, and I think this is only going to increase. We also asked about the notion of qualitative research that was powered by AI. So a very simple, so we read people an example. We said, okay, artificial intelligence is everywhere. What if there was a survey where they might ask, what's your favorite fruit? And you answer bananas. And then the AI would ask, and what is it that you like about bananas? And you might answer, I like the fact that it's got lots of potassium. The AI might then ask in a simple laddering kind of way, what is it about the potassium that you like? And so we gave that example, and then we asked people, would you like this idea? And we see, again, in the States, greater receptivity, but still a large number of people liking that notion. And then we asked the question about, would you prefer it to be a virtual voice or to be texted to you? So is the chat over text, or is the chat voice, interviewer-like? So most people were more comfortable with the text version, but I should point out that this is in the midst of a text-based survey, text and click based survey, and we have conditioned people to want to respond that way. But it's certainly, we've seen it in other things as well, that voice isn't necessarily what everybody gravitates to, but that'll probably change as people get used to the virtual assistants and being able to just shout out and have a response. So I've just covered a couple of different types of things that we've looked at. But what we can see is that there's lots of interest in using different ways of doing surveys, that the kind of way that we've used historically is going to have to adapt to the fact that people are going to be communicating in different ways, just as we've had to adapt to online, mobile, and whatever's next. So change is definitely coming. And I think when we think about the generational divide on even those data that we just saw, that we're going to see a fragmentation. We're going to see a division between young and old, rich and poor, a fragmentation that will be important because if we don't cover the ways that a certain group of people communicate, then we'll be missing them. And as in the case of the Zika virus public health study, that could have very significant implications. I think an implication of this is that the future, pardon me, the future is really all about design of surveys that is device agnostic. So it has to work on a virtual assistant, it has to work on a mobile device, it has to work on a desktop, it has to work in any way that you could possibly adapt possibly use and communicate the survey. That means that questions need to be simpler. They need to be yes, no, hot, not, something that's going to translate across devices. And that has implications for the way we work. One of the things that's good news is that we've been doing some research around binary questions and whether they get the same results as something more complicated. So we couldn't ask, for example, a rank order question. We could ask a 5-point scale, but if you're getting it over a virtual assistant, it gets tiresome pretty fast when they read out all the categories and you have to remember what that category was and say it back exactly to get the match. So what we've done here is we've got yes, no, which is the purple bars. We have the standard purchase intent question, 5-point scale, which are the gold bars, and then the blue bars are selection, which is just a list of statements. I'd buy it, I like it, so forth, and you pick the ones that you think represent it. Now, probably the most interesting thing to take away from this is that the pattern of answering, the decision you would make, which concept's best, which one's least attractive, is exactly the same across all of those. So we're coming to very similar conclusions, and we've seen this in many instances. I'm just going over this one example to be brief. One of the reasons that people have put forward for using more complicated scales is that they're more sensitive, but our data suggests that that's not always the case. Here we're comparing the correlation of a 5-point scale and a binary association with spend. And what we're seeing is that with the binary, it's at least as sensitive, it correlates as closely as the 5-point scale, or in fact, in some circumstances, better. So when we think about the notion of letting go of our, beloved scales, which have their origin in, the psychometrics of the 1920s, we can have some confidence that we can come to the same conclusions, which I think is encouraging because it is a big step to move forward and to change the way we ask questions. So, what if we say, oh, well, I've got norms, I can't give up on those norms, or I've always asked the question this way. They expect me to ask it as this with this 7-point scale or this 10-point scale. So what if we kind of drag our feet? Well, if we think back to that public health study, that can be very problematic. If we miss a segment of the population, if we don't report back information that's truly representative of the population that we're studying, and we give people the wrong answer, then we basically undermine our whole enterprise, because we're about finding a truth and conveying that truth. And if what we're reporting is something that actually doesn't represent the whole population because we really didn't want to change from that 7-point scale, and we give people the wrong answer and they make the wrong decisions, then we've kind of shot ourselves in the foot. We really don't have a choice. We must move forward. We're like this guy on the rock here. He can't really climb back down. We are on the cusp of change. We are looking at a fragmented future. And I believe that what we need to think about is how can we have really good, clean, device-agnostic design. We have to move forward. And the question I want to leave with everybody is, as the future races at us, what will you do? So thanks, Ray. Back to you.